If your mind is immaterial, if it's just a thinking thing with no physical properties, then how does it tell your hand to raise? This isn't just some random question. It's a question that exposes one of the most stubborn problems in all of philosophy, the mind-body problem. In 1643, Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia, one of the sharpest intellects of her time, pressed this very challenge onto René Descartes, the so-called father of modern philosophy. Descartes had just published his Meditations on First Philosophy, a revolutionary work that split reality into two distinct realms. The mind, an immaterial thinking substance, and the body, a mechanical extended substance. This idea of a separate mind and body, often referred to as dualism, was a radical idea as it promised to reconcile one of the most difficult questions, explaining how humans can both physically exist as machines and as conscious beings. But Elizabeth, a brilliant thinker in her own right, was not convinced. In a series of letters, she cornered Descartes with a devastatingly simple question. If the mind had no physical properties, no size, no location, no mass, then how could it possibly cause motion in the body? This wasn't just some simple request for clarification. It was a direct attack on the coherence of his entire system. Today, I'll argue that Elizabeth's critique exposes a fatal flaw in Cartesian dualism and that she was successful in her works as Descartes could not fully reconcile the mind-body interaction without abandoning his own principles. So, what exactly was Elizabeth's full challenge? So, Elizabeth's critique was not just some philosophical curiosity. It was a surgical dismantling of Descartes' dualism using his own tools. So, she begins with two key elements of his system. First, his physics. In Principles of Philosophy, Descartes states that motion only occurs when the body contacts another, with their extended surfaces physically colliding. This means that everything that occurs in this world, Descartes feels, exists in the physical plane, whether it be our senses and our perception, or whether it just be contacting someone else. Second, in his metaphysics, he defines the mind as a res cogitans, a thinking thing with no extension, no shape, and no location. In short, the mind was not physical in any way, fully showing in his idea that the mind only existed in some sort of realm that was not in the physical space that everything else existed. Elizabeth's genius was in putting these two ideas together. If physical motion demands contact, and the mind has no physical properties, then how can the mind possibly move the body? You can't cause motion without extension, and the mind, by Descartes' own account, doesn't have any. This would lead to the core contradiction in his system, as Elizabeth states. Descartes builds his entire physics on this mechanicalistic law of physicalness, where everything happens by physical contact, and then claims somehow that the mind can break these rules and act on the body. This wasn't just, this is some explanatory gap. This is a logical inconsistency. Elizabeth, in her letters, asked him to find what the soul or the mind is more clearly, and to explain how it can direct what he calls animal spirits, in the nerves initiating motion without any push, pull, or physical momentum. Elizabeth reveals that dualism isn't just complete, it contradicts the very laws it tries to preserve. And what's more striking, the same issue still haunts modern philosophy of mind, as we have never fully been able to see how this connection is possible. If physics is a closed system, where does consciousness fit? Elizabeth was asking questions centuries before today, and we still really do not have a full answer. Faced also with this devastating critique, Descartes really didn't try to revise his system. He retreated. So now, let's take a look at why his reply fails to solve the problem, and maybe even makes it worse. So, how does Descartes really respond to Elizabeth's challenge? In his letters, he offers two main strategies, but both ultimately crack into his system. First, he appeals to what we call a primitive notion of the mind-body union. In his letter, he claims that what we understand as the soul, the body, and their union as three basic distinct concepts. He admits that we fully can't grasp their union through metaphysical or scientific analysis, and says it's something we know through ordinary experience. When I will to raise my hand raises. That's a lived experience, he argues, and that is the evidence. So attacking this, explanatory gap between these two, Descartes basically says we'll never fully be able to understand it in the way that we exist in the world, and the only way we really do is through just doing it. There's no way to explain our actions how we do this. It's just that we do it, and the fact that we do it means that there is a separate mind and body, as he argues. But there's a problem. Elizabeth isn't asking what we feel. She's, as I say, asking how it works. And by this calling it a primitive union, Descartes is basically saying, it just does. And that's not an explanation, that's a placeholder. It assumes the very thing Elizabeth is questioning, that an immaterial mind can move a material body. Second, while he doesn't directly mention in these letters, Descartes' broader philosophy introduced the pineal gland as the meeting point between the soul and the body. He argues this tiny gland, which exists somewhere in our brain, is where the physical mind somehow directs the flow of the animal spirits, the particles that supposedly control motion. But this doesn't solve the problem, it just localizes the mystery. How can a non-physical mind interact with a physical gland at all? He doesn't give no mechanism, no contact, nothing that fits within his own laws of physics. He just states it's probably in this one place, that's how they exist. To borrow an analogy, this is like rejecting Newton's laws, but then explaining why apples fall by saying, gravity just works. It sidesteps the whole point of scientific inquiry. In short, Descartes' reply doesn't just leave questions unanswered. They reveal a deeper contradiction. He builds a system on strict physical causation, and then breaks his own rules to make dualism work. And as we'll see, this tension hasn't gone away. It still shapes the way we think about the mind today. So, was Elizabeth sexual? I definitely think so, yeah. She doesn't just raise any minor concern with Descartes' system. She identifies a central flaw, that the mind and the body, as Descartes defines them, cannot logically interact. And this is what makes her argument so powerful, is that almost 400 years later, it's still being the core objection to dualism that we're still studying today. Longevity really says something, as if her critique survives for centuries, it's probably hitting a nerve. As we clearly say in today's debate, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on the mind-body problem shows that even now, theories like physicalism, which claims that everything, including our mind, is in the physical, are still trying to solve this same issue. How can subjective experiences like feeling pain or thinking a thought emerge from purely physical processes in the brain? It's the same puzzle, just flipped. So, Elizabeth's challenge isn't just some historical footnote, it's still shaping philosophy and neuroscience today. Which leads us to the final question for all of us. If dualism doesn't work, if this mind-body interaction isn't made coherent, what's the alternative? Is everything just physical, or are we missing something to define our minds? Hopefully we'll learn. Thank you.